Cities have been the world's economic engines for centuries, attracting skilled workers and benefiting from economies of scale to create productive enterprises. Historically, urbanization and per capita GDP tend to move in close sync as countries develop. No country has ever reached middle-income status without urbanizing. By harnessing economies of scale, attracting firms, sharing knowledge, and fostering pools of talent, cities have a special ability to achieve results that are more than the sum of their parts, adding value for both society and enterprises. With the rise of massive urban centers in developing economies, we are witnessing the most significant shift in the Earth's economic center of gravity in history. The world economy is now truly becoming globally distributed out, less and less centered around the developed economies. The urban areas of Africa and Asia will absorb nearly all of the projected growth of the world population in the coming decades. Of the 2.5 billion new urban dwellers anticipated by 2050, 90% will live in Africa and Asia. China, India, and Nigeria being the primary locus of a process of urbanization that now offers hope for raising billions out of poverty and creating a more balanced overall distribution of resources in the world. Around the world, people are flocking to cities as points of access into these emerging global networks and the opportunities they provide. For this process of urbanization to be successful, the city has to connect its population into global economic networks of exchange, but many are ill-prepared for the scale of the process that is underway. When managed effectively, urban centers can be systems for connecting people and providing them with opportunities, as we have seen with the development of urban Asia. In China, a coalescence of urbanization and massive economic growth helped pull 680 million people out of extreme poverty over the course of just 30 years, unprecedented in history. The success of many Asian nations has shown us the capacity of urban centers connected to global supply chains to transform people's standard of living and opportunities. But in other parts of the world, urbanization has been a force for exclusion. Until recently, urbanization largely happened within countries with relatively high GDP. What has changed in the past decades is that it is increasingly happening in nations with very low GDP. These nations are the least well-equipped economically and socially to deal with the transformation. The huge migration into sub-Saharan African cities appears to overwhelm government planners and policymakers, with the outcome being that slum dwellers currently account for over 60% of urban population, while these African urban centers have had the highest inequality of wealth in the world. Cities that fail to meet the aspirations of the millions who are migrating in search of better opportunities run the risk of becoming failed projects, breeding new social and environmental challenges of an unprecedented scale and complexity. Lack of infrastructure creates congestion, pollution, and insufficient public services. Instead of connecting people, these urban systems sprawl out into disconnected slums as informal urban networks fill the gap of overextended and underfunded governments. These slums are huge urban systems with illegal arrangements of land use that generally lack infrastructure, public facilities, and basic services, such as improved drinking water, waste disposal, or transport. Much of the growth in urban networks over the coming decades will not be the formal planned infrastructure systems of the past, but instead informal settlements of this kind. The informal slums of developing nations are growing in a significant way. According to United Nations statistics, the number of people living in slum conditions has grown from 650 million in 1990 to 760 million in 2000, and as of 2017, nearly 1 billion people live in slums. This is set to double by 2030 under a business-as-usual scenario. As these slums are growing around the world, informal urban networks are becoming the new normal for urban development. Kibera, on the outskirts of Nairobi, is considered one of the largest, with some 600,000 people. Dharavi, in Mumbai, is home to upwards of 700,000 residents living in shacks. In Rio de Janeiro, the favelas started appearing in the 1950s and now house a total of about 1 million people. Inclusive growth is a major challenge that we are far from achieving. Instead of connecting people, many of these emerging megacities are becoming more economically unequal. They are becoming more fractured and compartmentalized. Over the decades, developing economies have been getting better at achieving growth, but have often seen the benefits of that growth concentrated in the upper levels of the income distribution. Socially, our current model of urbanization in many places around the world generates multiple forms of inequality and exclusion, which creates spatial divisions in cities, often characterized by slum areas or gated communities in places like Sao Paulo or Johannesburg. Inequality is now recognized as a major emerging urban issue, as the gap between the rich and the poor in most countries is at its highest levels in decades. Increasingly, environmental and social sustainability are becoming linked and seen as no longer nice things to have, but instead actual security issues. Environmental degradation is changing ecosystems around the world, ecosystems that hundreds of millions of small-scale subsistence farmers are dependent upon. When they change and people can no longer continue with their traditional ways of life, this often leads to migration into cities, which are ill-prepared for them, the net result being that they end up in slums. As the environmental crisis unfolds going forward, this linkage will only become stronger and more critical. Environmental changes will feed through to reveal previously latent networks of vulnerability in our social systems and technology infrastructure. As global interconnectivity proliferates, these networks of vulnerability will spread farther and shocks will propagate faster. What happens in the slums of Mumbai and Lagos will increasingly affect everyone. Globalization is the building of global systems of economic, social, and technological organization. This connectivity crosses borders, reduces old divides, and creates interdependencies that bind diverse people and places through shared interests, opportunities, and threats. Global cities are physical superconnectors in this network, but they are also super disconnectors. When urbanization is successful, people become integrated into a global economy and society. When it is unsuccessful, they become disconnected and divided in new ways. But the consequences of that are no longer local. With interconnectivity comes interdependencies, and the benefits and losses become increasingly shared globally. In the space of just the past few decades, we have created a new economic system of organization in the form of global supply chains and the urban networks that support them. Global cities are now the engines driving the world forward, and how the process of urbanization plays out in the coming decades will shape the structure of what happens this century and indeed the future of the relationship between human beings and the planet. The current process of urbanization is nothing less than a fundamental transformation in the human habitat. The indigenous environment of humanity is changing from the natural environment to the engineered environment at a breathtaking speed. In the space of just a few short decades, we will remake our environment and the patterns of organization that shape society and economy. In this process, we don't just rebuild the world around us, but urbanization changes us. It creates a new environment, new ways of thinking, new patterns of work, of governance of production and exchange, of interaction between people, through which we come to redefine ourselves and our relationship to the natural environment.